Hello. So, in this session, we will cover some of the teachings of the classic Greek philosophers. For that purpose, we will start from the pre-Socratic philosophers and we will go as far as Epicurus. This is interesting period of time because it is exactly the end of the Iron Age and the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic period after the death of Alexander the Great and the death of Aristotle. Mm, In the last session, we covered some of the most important cultural and technological advances in human societies. And we started more specifically with the development of civilization, and we located the Sumerian and Akkadian cultures like the centers for the development of the first human cities and civilization. And we ended with the Hittite civilization in Anatolia. And for us, this civilization is important because it is a point that show how is the diffusion of knowledge from the Mesopotamia region towards Greece and other directions. But in our case, we are focusing or centered in this European school in Greece now. So the Hittites were the first documented civilizations to have iron smelting, even though, as we discussed last session, other civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, probably they had also the same amount of iron items in antiquity like the Hittites. But let's say that for us it's important the Hittites because they show this diffusion of knowledge. And the Hittites were also Indo-European language speakers. So this is a clear definition of this transition. Also, we could locate some important historical events, like for example the Trojan Wars, that exemplify how was this diffusion of knowledge. Because even though these wars were happening in a time where in the Hittite Empire or civilization they already had iron smelting, in the Trojan Wars still the soldiers were armored with bronze instruments. So the diffusion took place in a through Greece, but the process of adapting the society and the culture to the production of iron items is a slow process. Mm, so today we will discuss about these classic Greek philosophers and the classic Greek natural philosophy. But we must also recognize that other cultures in history have developed their own cosmology and have reached at least the minimum, the same level like the Greek philosophers. One example is India, which has also uh, a lot of examples on development of science like astronomy and cosmology, and they have also this link which is common between all the ancient cultures between science and religion. So we can find this same process with the Greeks, with the Indians and Egyptians as well. So let's continue and let's start with the first philosophers. First, we must say that ancient Greeks were divided into four main peoples: the Dorians, Aeolians, Achaeans, and Ionians. At the end of the previous session, we were talking about the Iron Age and how technological advantages took place in the battlefields. One of one example of such situations is present in Greece, when less advanced tribes but better armor will defeat more advanced societies. Such is the case of the Dorians, a barbaric Greek tribe equipped with iron weapons that dominated the Greek peninsula around 1100 BC. Other example was the conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites, a story that is well described in religious textbooks, for example with the stories of David versus Goliath or Samson. Probably the Philistines were at least one of the so-called sea peoples as described by the Egyptians. These sea peoples attacked and raided Egyptian and Mediterranean cities during the Late Bronze Age and established in what is called today like Israel. The origin of the Philistines is not completely clear, but there is a genetic evidence of Greek origin and Greek pottery in archaeological sites. However, there are also some uncertainties. for example, about the language they spoke. Their cities, we know they were well planned, and it has been estimated that they had olive oil industry with a capacity equivalent to a 30% of today Israel's capacity. As a result of the conflicts and commerce, not only goods were transferred but also chemical knowledge that later result in the spread of alchemy. Before, we also described how the iron smelting knowledge entered Greece from the Anatolia, the land of the previous Hittite civilization. At this time of history, previous Hittite cities were occupied by the Ionians, and their most important Ionian city in Asia Minor was Miletus, the home of the pre-Socratic Tales of Miletus. Thales of Miletus was the first documented philosopher to make fundamental questions about the so-called natural philosophy. With this, I want to stress that probably before him there were other philosophers who made this type of questions, not only in Greece but in any other civilization as well. Just for history is last the evidence of this process. In general, we can say that the Greeks around 600 BC turned their interest to the nature of the universe and the why of things, and for this Thales asked, for example, if one thing, like a rock, can be changed into another, like copper, then what is the true nature of the substance? Can any substance be changed into any other substance? What is the unifying principle of diversity? And more important, is it possible that all the substances are different aspects of one basic material? For him, for Thales, the answer to the last question was yes. And the element which was a basic material, it was water, because for him it seemed to be present in the greatest quantities in the world. The basic idea uh, of a basic element, or the idea of a basic element or a constituent, was accepted later by many philosophers for hundreds of years, but not his decision of uh, of the element itself. So for them, water might not be that element. Additionally, in his cosmology, Thales visualized our planet like a floating disk surrounded by water and topped by a semi-sphere of sky. Uh, Thales was also a pioneer to trying to explain the world rationally and away from the gods. This is a key point because in most civilizations, if not all, science has always been related to religion. Examples can be found in Egypt, where the development of chemistry is strongly related to the process of embalming and afterlife, or in India, where the first natural philosophy is described in the Vedas itself. Thales believed that the arche was the origin of life. So this basic constituent or the basic material that he called arche was the origin. It requires to have certain properties, like for example, it has to be the origin of life, it has to be the unifying principle and the source of motion. Therefore, it was, and additionally, it was not an abstract element. So it has to be a physical one itself. So he concluded that the arche was water because it can explain the motion, because as you can see, rivers and oceans, they have their own motion. Uh, Water also can explain life because life without water is not possible. And it can also explain the change in the states of matter, like in the case of metals that can be made liquid after heating and resolidified again. And this is a process that can be seen also with water. So for him, the fact that metals could be made liquid is because they contain this water. Later, Anaximenes proposed that the element was air. So even though they come from the same school and from Miletus, Anaximenes proposed that the element was air. So he assumed that the basic element was a real theory, but he proposed another element which was air. Probably he chose this material based on the idea that the sky surrounding the planet was all made of air. And let us remember that they did not have the notion of vacuum. So for them, the sky goes from the earth all the way up to the stars. And for Anaximenes and for these philosophers, this was all filled with air. We can assume that Anaximenes' proposal was a middle point between the archy of water by Thales and the infinite and boundless apeiron as defined by Anaximander, and that you can see in the video made by Christina. In this sense, Anaximenes can be regarded as the synthesis or the fusion between the theories or concepts developed by Thales and Anaximander. For Heraclitus of Ephesus, and Ephesus was another Ionian city, then for Heraclitus it was the fieriness in everything that made the change so inevitable. So So in nature, the most characteristic substance for change was fire. However, not everyone agrees, and for example, for Parmenides, who was another Eleatic philosopher, he believed that nothing really changes, and thus we cannot believe our senses. But we will discuss this notion uh, of motion later with Epicurus. About the historical context, during the time of Anaximenes, the Ionian coast was conquered by the Persians. So after a failed revolt, migrating Ionians brought his knowledge with them to the western lands. Now it is easy to smile at these early notions, but actually these uh, guesses were quite profound, and even they impact the development of science for thousands of years. Now, to complete the theory of the elements, we must talk about Pythagoras. He was born in the Ionian city of Samos in the year 582 BC, but left the island in 529 BC and established in southern Italy after the Persian conquest of the Ionian cities in the time of Anaximenes. It was Empedocles, a native of Sicily and influenced by Pythagoras, who proposed that it should not be only one element, but it could be more, and he proposed that it was four. So he included the fire of Heraclitus, the air of Anaximenes, the water of Thales, and the earth proposed by Empedocles himself. And with this contribution, uh, this was the history of the four elements as developed by the pre-Socratic philosophers. After Socrates, it was adopted and completed by Aristotle. So Aristotle accepted the concept of the four elements, but he did not imagine that the water we could touch and feel was actually the element or the archy water. It was merely the closest actual substance to it. He proposed innate sets of properties for each element, resulting from the mixture of the following characteristics: so coldness versus hot, and dryness versus moist, where the opposites could not be mixed. So, for example, fire was the mixture of hot and dry, or air was the mixture of hot and moist, and earth was the mixture of cold and dry, and water the mixture of cold and moist. Additionally, he assigned that each of these four elements has its own characteristic. For instance, the nature of earth is to fall, while the nature of fire is to rise. And finally, he concluded that uh, heavenly bodies are their motion is in unchanged circles, and as the heaven seems unchanged, then Aristotle considered the ether or aether to be perfect, eternal, quite different from the four imperfect elements of the earth. And this is like the fifth element that he proposed for this theory. Here, finally, it's important to recall that this theory of the four elements and the fifth with ether and the contribution of Aristotle, it was accepted uh, notion for the development of natural sciences, and it persisted alive, and it was taught in universities for 2000 years. But the four elements theory was not the only theory available, and other questions arose simultaneously among the Greek philosophers, especially one involving the divisibility of matter. It seems that Leucippus, another Ionian pre-Socratic philosopher, was the first to question the limits of division and subdivision of matter. He believed that eventually a piece of matter would be obtained which was as small as it could be and no further division was possible. After Leucippus, Democritus, one disciple of Leucippus, named these particles as atoms, giving place to the doctrine known as atomism, that matter is made up of ultimately small particles and is not indefinitely divisible. More important and deep, atoms were not just the small pieces of the same material, but they maintain that the atoms of each element were distinct in size and shape. So they gave these two properties to atoms, only two properties, size and shape. And that it was this distinction that made each element different in properties. Thus, the actual substances were composed of mixtures of atoms of the different elements, and one substance could be changed into another by altering the nature of this mixture. Democritus believed that the atoms are too small for human senses to be detected, and they are also infinitely many in quantity and variety. Democritus was also skeptical about the possibility to gain any knowledge about the world on the basis of our senses, and he claimed that our senses deceive us, because his reasoning was that if atoms only have two characteristics, size and shape, then the characteristics we feel from macroscopic bodies, like for example taste, are just as a representation or the product of our senses, not properties of the macroscopic body itself. And he claimed that it's not possible to do these measurements or to learn from nature using our senses because our senses are subjective. And this is explained because, for example, honey can be bitter for an ill person, while for all others can be sweet. So, unlike Democritus, Epicurus believed that properties like sweetness, in fact, belong to the microscopic bodies and are a consequence of the relations between the atoms in that body. So, Epicurus believed that mm, the macroscopic characteristics or the characteristics of macroscopic bodies depend on the relationships between atoms. Okay, so he didn't claim that the atoms itself have any characteristic about taste or sweetness or something like that. Just he claimed that the mixture of different atoms, they can result in a characteristic for a macroscopic body. But we will talk about Epicurus in the next slides. Uh, Remember also that the Greek philosophers did not experiment. They didn't realize any experiment like we do today in science. So they came to their conclusions just by what they call like first principles, this reasoning process. Here, about this theory of atomism, we have to say that Aristotle did not accept the atomism or the atomistic theory. And being Aristotle one of the most influential philosophers in history, the atomism remained unpopular for 2000 years. However, atomism did not disappear completely, and another Greek philosopher, Epicurus, who expanded the atomism later. Uh, Another person responsible for maintaining this theory alive, it was the Roman poet Titus Lucretius Carus, better known like Lucretius, who wrote a poem called On the Nature of Things, where he collects this knowledge from Epicurus and made it mm, simple knowledge to the public. This poem survived in full and preserved the atomist view into modern times. In general, we can say that atomism is a type of reductionism, meaning that it attempts to explain the natural world and its associations in terms of other simple or more fundamental phenomena. In other words, it tries to interpret a complex system as the sum of its parts. Until here, we have discussed mainly the pre-Socratic philosophers, but we can say that Socrates, even though the most influential philosopher, he is better known for his studies on politics and morality more than natural philosophy. Nevertheless, we can attribute him to introduce what we know as the Socratic method. According to this method, when you search for knowledge about a problem, you should ask questions so you can break the problem into smaller parts, and then you can make hypotheses to test the real nature of that problem. In this, this is a methodology that is a foundation for the scientific method we use in science today. Next, after Socrates, uh, we find Plato, and Plato was Socrates' student and founded a physical school called the Academy to teach Athenians the Socrates method. He taught a Pythagoras-inspired idealism, a theory of nature based on perfect abstractions or rules, of which the real world is just an imperfect example. This idealism made him look more like a philosopher than a scientist. However, he was a very prolific author, and his only rival was his student Aristotle. In comparison to Plato, Aristotle described nature based on empirical evidence. It means based on observation. Aristotle, originally from Macedonia, studied in the Academy of Plato for 20 years until Plato died. Later on, he moved back to Macedonia, where he was the tutor of Alexander the Great. And similarly, like Plato, he founded a school called the Lyceum. Returning to Epicurus, we can say he was born at the beginning of the Hellenistic period after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and Aristotle's death in 322 BC, which is considered the end of the Iron Age. More precisely, Epicurus was born around 341 BC, 7 years after Plato's death, and grew up in Athenian colony of Samos, an island in the Mediterranean Sea. He was about 19 years old when Aristotle died, and he studied philosophy under the followers of Democritus and Plato. Epicurus died from kidney stones around 270 BC. Epicurus believed that atoms are uncuttable bits of matter flying through empty space, and he tried to explain all natural phenomena in atomic terms. To meet his followers, Epicurus bought a house with a garden just outside Athens, and he called it the Garden, which was his school. On its major works, we can find letters on metaphysics, atomic explanations for meteorological phenomena, letters on ethics, and he believed that atoms are the basic constituent of the world. Epicurus rejected the existence of Platonic forms and immaterial soul, and said that gods do not influence our lives. Because of the latter, and with the rise of Christianism, Epicureanism went to decline. However, certain aspects of Epicurus' teachings revived during the Renaissance. Most of its original works, uh, handwritten, are lost, but Lucretius collected Epicurean thoughts in his poem On the Nature of Things. Other authors describing Epicureanism were Plutarch and Cicero. but both were hostile towards Epicureanism and may skew his views for their own purposes. In his metaphysics, Epicurus starts from two simple points. First, we see that there are bodies in motion, and second, nothing comes into existence from what does not exist. From the first, he concluded that if there is a motion, then there must be empty space. And from the second, he concluded that there must be atoms, because if not, then matter would dissolve into nothing. In his metaphysics, he also concluded that the universe is infinite, unlike Aristotle. Similarly, if the universe is infinite, so is the number of atoms and voids. In comparison with Democritus, Epicurus added another characteristic to atoms: weight, and it was the weight that explained, according to him, the motion of atoms, the movement of atoms downwards. Additionally, Epicurus notes that atoms not only fall by their weight, but they also swerve, which is a random movement, and this movement produces the interaction between different atoms, and as a consequence, the formation of macroscopic bodies. His work also centers on the mechanistic explanations of natural phenomena. He did so to remove the will of gods as the reason to explain natural phenomena, for example in meteorological processes. He claimed that everything could be explained in atomistic terms. Finally, Epicurus in his work tries to replace the teleological explanations of natural phenomena with mechanistic ones. According to teleology, the explanation of natural phenomena should be given in terms of the purpose that a given component gives to a system. In Epicurus' way, we should instead consider the cause by which this component is part of the system. This other point of view, the second point of view from Epicurus, is sometimes considered like a proto-Darwinian way for explaining processes like evolution, for example. Additionally, Epicurus tries to explain the perception in terms of the interaction of atoms with the sense organs in humans. Like, for example, to explain vision, he says that objects continually throw off one atom-thick layer, and like a skin of an onion, and these images or eidola fly through the air and bang into one's eyes, and from this he could explain vision. That even today we know is not true. This is his attempt to describe every natural process in terms of atomistic explanations. So this was the material for this week, and in the code space I will let you a link for to get more details about Epicureanism and more specific on Lucretius' poem on the nature of things, where he describes the work of Epicurus, not only from a physical point of view, but also cultural, in a religious point of view, and so on. So thank you so much, and see you next week.